The Imperial Grand Hotel looked exactly the way power likes to present itself: quiet, polished, untouchable. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling like frozen light. A soft piano melody drifted through the air. Guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses moved across the marble floor with slow, confident steps. Everything in that lobby spoke the same languagey status. And near the tall glass windows where the afternoon sun poured in, sat an older man in a simple black outfit. No designer logo, no expensive watch, no bodyguards, just a cup of tea and complete calm. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He simply sat there as if he belonged, in a way that didn't need to be proven. A few people noticed him, but only for a second. To them, he looked like someone who had walked into the wrong place by accident. And that was the moment the atmosphere began to shift. Because from the far end of the lobby, 2 hotel security guards had already locked their eyes on him. They spoke briefly to each other. Then they started walking in his direction. Not casually, not politely, with purpose. Their footsteps were firm against the marble, cutting through the music, through the conversations, through the carefully maintained luxury. One of the receptionists looked up, and her expression changed, like she knew something was about to go wrong. But it was too late. The guards were already getting closer. The older man lifted his teacup and took a slow sip, completely unaware, or perhaps completely unconcerned, about what was coming. Because in less than a minute, in the middle of the most expensive hotel in the city, they were going to ask Steven Seagal to leave, and the entire lobby was about to witness a mistake that would be impossible to undo. The 2 security guards stopped directly in front of his table. Up close, the contrast was even sharper. Perfectly pressed uniforms, earpieces, cold professional expressions. And across from them the older man, still seated, still calm, still holding his teacup as if nothing in the world required urgency. "Sir," the taller guard said, his tone already carrying authority, "this lounge is reserved for premium guests only." The man looked up slowly, not confused, not offended, just attentive. "I am a guest," he replied, his voice low and steady. The second guard gave a quick glance at his clothes. The simple black outfit, the absence of any visible luxury, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a faint, dismissive smirk. "Then you won't mind coming with us to verify that," he said. There was no aggression in the older man's movements. He placed the teacup gently onto the saucer, adjusted it so it wouldn't spill, then rose to his feet in one smooth, unhurried motion. That calmness should have ended the situation. But it didn't. Because the guards had already decided who he was. And once people make a decision based on appearance, they rarely step back. Next time, the taller guard added loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "You should check the hotel policy before sitting in private areas." The words were polite. The tone was not. A couple sitting nearby stopped their conversation. A businessman near the pillar lowered his newspaper slightly. At the reception desk, one of the staff members looked up, watching carefully now. The older man didn't respond. Not a single defensive word. And that silence began to draw even more attention than an argument would have. As they started walking him across the lobby, the distance suddenly felt longer than before. Every step echoed. Every movement was visible. A phone appeared in someone's hand, then another. As he being removed, someone whispered. He wasn't doing anything. The second guard spoke again, this time with a short, dry laugh. "You can't just walk into places like this and expect service." The sentence hung in the air. Heavy, public, deliberate. For the first time, the older man stopped walking. Not in resistance, just for a brief second. He turned his head slightly toward the guard, not with anger, not with challenge, but with a look that was impossible to read. Calm. Deep, almost patient. Then he continued walking. That was the moment the energy in the lobby changed. Because people were no longer watching out of curiosity. They were watching out of discomfort. Something about the way this man carried himself didn't match the role the guards had assigned to him. Weak people argue. Embarrassed people explain. Angry people react. He did none of those things. At the reception desk, the young receptionist straightened her posture. Her eyes moved from the guards to the man, and then to the computer screen in front of her, like she was already searching for something. "Your room number," the taller guard said, now fully in control of the scene. The older man met her eyes instead of answering the guard, and when he spoke, his voice was calm enough to cut through the entire lobby without being loud. "My name is Seagal," he said. "Steven Seagal." The receptionist froze, not slightly, completely. Her fingers stopped above the keyboard. Her expression shifted from professional neutrality to sudden, unmistakable recognition. But the guards didn't notice, because they were still looking at him the same way. Still seeing the same simple clothes, the same quiet posture, The same man they had already decided did not belong. "Sir." The second guard interrupted, impatient now. "We asked for a room number, not a name." A few guests exchanged glances. Someone near the entrance quietly stepped aside, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. Behind the reception desk, another employee leaned toward the first and whispered, "Call upstairs." The older man didn't repeat his name. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, composed, waiting, like time was not his concern. And in that moment, though most people didn't yet understand why, the balance of power in the room had already begun to shift. Because the receptionist had picked up the phone, and her hands were shaking. Have you ever seen someone judged by their appearance and stay completely calm? Comment your country below. I want to see who's watching this moment unfold. The silence at the reception desk didn't last long. It stretched for a few seconds, just enough for people to feel that something had changed. And then the taller guard leaned forward, his patience clearly fading. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice louder now, sharper. "If you don't have a room number, you need to leave the hotel." The words were no longer professional. They were personal. The receptionist tried to speak, but the guard raised his hand slightly, not touching her, just enough to stop her from interrupting. "We're handling it." That single sentence sent a visible ripple through the staff behind the desk. Because now it wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was control. The older man, Steven, stood exactly where he was. No shift in posture, no tension in his shoulders, no sign that the situation had any emotional weight for him at all, and that calmness was beginning to do something unexpected to the people watching. It was making them uncomfortable with the guards. "Sir, you're creating a scene?" the second guard added, even though Steven had not said a single word. A quiet murmur moved through the lobby. Why are they talking to him like that? He's not even arguing. Several phones were now fully raised, not hidden, not discreet, recording openly. Steven slowly turned his head and looked around the lobby, not at the guests themselves, but at the space, as if he were taking in the entire atmosphere. The chandeliers, the marble floor, the staff standing in rigid silence. Then his eyes returned to the guards, still calm, still patient. "I believe she was about to help you," he said softly, nodding toward the receptionist. The tone was respectful, but the meaning was clear. "You are rushing a situation you don't understand." The taller guard exhaled through his nose a short, irritated breath. "No, sir, what you need to do is leave." And this time he gestured toward the main entrance, not the reception, the exit. That gesture changed everything, because it removed the last layer of professionalism from the encounter. Now it was public removal, public judgment, public humiliation. A couple near the lounge stood up from their seats, pretending to walk past, just to get closer to the scene. A man in a business suit lowered his phone slightly and whispered, "This is going to be bad for the hotel." Behind the desk, the receptionist finally spoke, her voice careful, almost fragile. "Sir, please, just a moment." But again, the guard cut her off. "Miss, we'll take responsibility." Steven looked at her, not at the guards, and gave a small, almost invisible nod, a silent reassurance. And that single gesture did something powerful. It shifted the emotional center of the entire lobby. Because now people weren't just watching a man being removed. They were watching a man who was protecting the staff from embarrassment, while he himself was being disrespected. The second guard stepped closer. Last warning. Close enough now that the situation felt physically tense. Close enough that any normal person would have stepped back. Steven didn't move. Not an inch. Not in defiance. Not in challenge. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that belongs to someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to fear. And for the first time, the taller guard hesitated. It was brief, almost invisible. But it was there. Because something about this man's presence didn't match the role of someone who needed to be thrown out. The receptionist turned the monitor slightly, her eyes wide. She was looking at the name on the screen. Looking at Steven. Looking back at the screen again. Her breathing had changed. One of the managers appeared from the hallway behind the desk, walking quickly but trying not to run. He leaned toward her. She whispered something into his ear. His face lost all color. He turned immediately toward the private elevators. No explanation. No pause. Just fast, urgent steps. And that was the moment when the first real wave of realization moved through the crowd. Because now the hotel staff were no longer watching the guards. They were watching Steven. The guards still didn't see it. Still standing there. Still convinced they were in control. Still believing they were removing an ordinary guest who didn't belong. But the energy in the room had already shifted away from them. Completely. Steven adjusted the sleeve of his black outfit slowly, calmly, like a man with all the time in the world. And in the reflection of the polished marble floor, You could see it clearly. Security guards standing with authority that was about to collapse. Hotel staff frozen between fear and urgency. Guests holding their breath, phones recording. And at the center of it all, a man who had not raised his voice once. A man who had not defended himself. A man who had not shown even the smallest sign of anger. Because he didn't need to. And somewhere above them, a private elevator had just been activated, coming down, fast, toward the lobby, toward the mistake that had already gone too far to be hidden. Because in a few seconds, someone was going to arrive who would change the entire situation. The quiet hum of the private elevator descending could not be heard, but somehow, everyone in the lobby felt it, not as a sound, as pressure. A tension that settled into the air and made every second stretch longer than it should. The taller guard had lost what little patience he had left. "Sir, this is the last time I'm saying it," he snapped. "You need to leave the premises. Now." The word premises echoed louder than it should have. Because it wasn't a request anymore. It was an order. Steven stood in the same place, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged. The calm on his face didn't look like compliance. It looked like certainty. The second guard stepped forward and reached for his arm. Not gently, not professionally. Firm, controlling. The kind of grip meant to move someone whether they agreed or not. A sharp gasp moved through the guests. Phones lifted higher. Someone near the lounge whispered, "No, don't touch him," but it was too late. The guard pulled, just slightly. Just enough to make the act visible to everyone in the lobby. Public, humiliating, irreversible. The receptionist covered her mouth with her hand. One of the junior staff took a step back as if the scene had suddenly become dangerous. And still, Steven did not resist. He didn't pull his arm away. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked down at the hand gripping his sleeve, then back up at the guard, with the same unreadable calm. "I would advise you to let go," he said quietly. No threat, no anger, no change in tone. That made it worse. Because now the guard felt challenged without being challenged. "Oh, really?" the taller guard said, stepping closer, his voice filled with a forced confidence that didn't match the shift in the room. "And why is that?" Steven's eyes moved past him for a brief moment, toward the private elevator, then back again. "I'm not saying it for my sake," he replied. The words were simple. But something in them made the second guard's grip tighten instead of release. A mistake driven by ego. "You don't give orders here," the guard said, pushing him one step toward the entrance. That single push changed everything. The movement was small, but the message was not, and the entire lobby reacted at once. A collective intake of breath. Someone dropped their phone. The sound of it hitting the marble floor cracked through the silence. Because now it was no longer about a guest being escorted out. It was about a man being physically removed, publicly, unjustly. The receptionist finally raised her voice, unable to stop herself. "Sir, please?" But the taller guard cut her off again. "We said we'll handle it." Behind them, the manager who had rushed away earlier reappeared at the edge of the lobby, and he wasn't alone. Two senior staff members stood beside him, their faces tight with controlled panic. He didn't shout. He didn't run. But the speed of his walk was enough to make several guests turn their heads. Because the expression on his face didn't match a routine situation. It matched a crisis. Still, the guards didn't notice. Still focused on the man in front of them. Still believing the authority in the room belonged to them. Steven adjusted his balance slightly after the push, not in reaction, but in perfect control of his own movement. Like someone who could not be moved unless he chose to be. And that was the moment the taller guard did the one thing that could not be undone. He placed his hand flat against Steven's chest and shoved him back. Not hard enough to knock him down, but hard enough to create space. Hard enough for everyone to see. The sound of the movement, the shift of shoes against polished marble, echoed through the lobby like a crack of thunder. Complete silence followed. No whispers, no movement. Even the piano music seemed to disappear into the air. Steven took one single step back to regain his position. Then he stopped, centered, still. His eyes lifted slowly and met the guards, not with anger, not with humiliation, with something far more unsettling, disappointment. And for the first time, the taller guard felt it, not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable sensation that the situation was no longer under his control. Behind him, a voice, sharp, authoritative, and filled with restrained urgency, cut through the silence. "Take your hands off him, right now." Every head in the lobby turned at once. The manager had arrived, his face pale, his breathing uneven, and behind him, the doors of the private elevator were opening. The guard's hand was still on Steven's chest, for one final second. One final moment where he still had the chance to step back on his own, but his pride held him there. And that was the point of no return. Because the man stepping out of the elevator was not just another guest. He was the one person in the building who held absolute authority. And he was walking straight towards Steven Seagal. The doors of the private elevator were fully open now, but no one stepped out immediately. And somehow that made the silence heavier. The manager who had rushed forward stopped a few steps away from Steven, not daring to come closer until the situation behind him caught up. "Let go," he repeated, this time lower, more controlled, but far more serious. The taller guard didn't move, not because he hadn't heard. Because he was still trying to understand why a senior manager looked like a man standing in front of a disaster. "Sir, we are handling a removal. You are not handling anything," the manager cut in. The words were sharp, but his eyes were not on the guards, they were on Steven. Careful, respectful, almost apologetic. That alone was enough to make several guests exchange glances. Because authority had just shifted, and everyone felt it. The second guard finally released Steven's arm, slowly, as if his hand had suddenly become too heavy to keep there. But the taller one still stood his ground, trying to hold on to the last pieces of control. "This man has no verified room," he insisted, though now his voice carried a trace of uncertainty. Steven adjusted his sleeve again, the same small, precise movement, as if the entire confrontation had been nothing more than a brief interruption in his afternoon. Then he spoke calm, measured. "I gave my name." The manager swallowed. "Yes, sir, we know." The word "sir" landed like a shockwave. Not loud, not dramatic, but powerful enough to travel through every corner of the lobby. Because now everyone understood. This was not a guest being questioned. This was someone the hotel staff recognized, respected, feared losing. The taller guard turned slightly toward the manager. "Do you know him?" The manager didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted toward the open elevator, waiting. And that waiting created something worse than anger for the guards. It created suspense. Because now they were no longer the center of the scene. They were standing inside a situation that was moving beyond them. Two more senior staff members had appeared near the reception. None of them spoke. None of them intervened. All of them watched Steven with the same careful distance. The way people stand near someone important without wanting to interrupt. The receptionist had stepped back from her desk completely now. Both hands pressed together in front of her, her eyes moving between Steven and the elevator. Guests were no longer pretending to walk past. They had stopped openly, watching, recording, waiting. Steven's gaze moved once across the lobby, slow, observant, taking in the chandeliers, the marble floor, the rows of silent staff. Not as a man impressed by luxury, but as a man completely unaffected by it. Then his eyes returned to the guard in front of him, and in a voice so calm it almost disappeared into the air, he said, "This can still end well for you. Not a threat, not a warning, a chance." That made the guard laugh, but the sound came out wrong. Too quick, too forced. "End well for me," he repeated, as if trying to convince himself he was still in control. From the open elevator, footsteps finally began to echo across the marble. Slow, measured, each one landing with quiet authority. The manager stepped aside immediately, head lowered, and every member of staff followed the same movement in a silent chain reaction. The taller guard noticed it. That synchronized respect. That automatic submission. And for the first time, real doubt crossed his face. Because this was not how normal hotel protocol looked. Steven didn't turn toward the approaching figure. He didn't need to. He already knew who it was. The footsteps stopped just behind the manager. No one spoke. No one breathed loudly enough to be heard. And the air in the lobby felt different, charged with the presence of someone who carried absolute power in this building. Still, the guards had not fully turned around. Still caught in that final moment between arrogance and realization, Steven finally lifted his teacup from the reception counter where it had been placed earlier by a nervous staff member. He held it for a second, then set it back down untouched. A small gesture, but it carried the weight of a decision. He was no longer just a guest in this moment. He was the calm center of a situation that was about to collapse, and then a voice spoke from behind the guards. Low, controlled, impossible to ignore. "What exactly is happening here?" The taller guard turned, and the color drained from his face, because the man standing there was the owner of the hotel. Have you ever seen a situation change in 1 second when the truth arrived? Comment calme pour if you believe staying calm is the real strength. The moment the hotel owner stepped fully into the lobby, the entire atmosphere changed. Not gradually, instantly. Conversations that had been frozen in whispers disappeared completely. Staff members straightened as if pulled by a single invisible string. Even the sound of distant cutlery from the restaurant seemed to fade. Power had entered the room. Real power. The taller guard turned around first, and whatever confidence he had left vanished from his face. Sir, we were just... The owner didn't even look at him. Not yet. His eyes went directly to Steven. And what everyone saw next was something no one expected. The most powerful man in the building, the man whose name was on the front of the hotel, lowered his head slightly, a gesture of pure respect. Mr. Seagal, he said, his voice controlled but filled with urgency. I sincerely apologize for this unacceptable behavior. A shockwave moved through the lobby. Guests looked at each other in disbelief. Phones tilted to capture a better angle. Because the scene had completely reversed. The man who had been pushed, stopped, ordered to leave, was now the one receiving a public apology from the owner himself. The second guard took a step back. Then another. As if distance could undo what had already happened. But the taller guard remained frozen in place, caught between the need to speak and the realization that every word would make it worse. Steven inclined his head slightly. No anger, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. It was a misunderstanding, he said calmly. The owner turned slowly toward the guards, and this time his expression was no longer diplomatic. It was cold. What? He asked, each word precise. Did you think you were doing? Neither guard answered, because there was no answer that could survive this moment. This man, the owner continued, gesturing toward Steven with open respect, is a personal guest of mine. The sentence landed like a final verdict. Not just a guest, a personal guest. The hierarchy was now undeniable. The manager lowered his head even further. The receptionist looked as if she might faint from the release of tension. Around the lobby, people began whispering again, but now the tone had changed, from curiosity to awe. The taller guard finally found his voice. Sir, he didn't have a room number and... He gave his name. The owner interrupted. Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. And you decided that wasn't enough. The guard's mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. Because the truth was standing in front of him, calm, composed, untouchable, and there was nothing left to argue against. Steven adjusted the cuff of his sleeve again, the same small movement that had followed every moment of disrespect. A gesture of control, of patience, of a man who had never lost his balance for a single second. I hope they were only trying to protect the hotel, Steven said quietly. The word stunned everyone, because he had just given them a way to breathe again. A way to survive the moment. The owner looked at him, surprised, grateful, but the disappointment in his eyes when he turned back to the guards did not disappear. You will step aside, he said, not loudly, not emotionally, but with absolute finality. The guards moved immediately, too quickly, like men trying to escape their own shadows. Steven was now standing alone in the center of the lobby, not as a man who had been removed, but as the point around which the entire room had reorganized itself. The owner gestured toward the private lounge. Please, Mr. Seagal, your table is ready upstairs. Not a request, an honor. Several guests moved instinctively out of the path. Staff members lowered their heads as he walked. But Steven didn't move right away. He turned slightly toward the two guards, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked directly at them. Not with anger. Not with superiority, with something far more difficult to face. Calm understanding, the kind that forces a person to confront themselves. The taller guard couldn't hold the gaze. His eyes dropped to the floor, because in that moment he understood something that had nothing to do with hotel policy, uniforms, or authority. He hadn't misjudged a guest. He had misjudged a human being. Steven gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, not dismissal, just closure. Then he turned and walked toward the private elevator beside the owner. No hurry, no drama. The doors opened. He stepped inside. And just before they closed, the entire lobby remained standing in silence. Watching. Because everyone there knew they had witnessed more than a mistake being corrected. They had witnessed the complete collapse of false authority in the presence of real dignity. And when the elevator doors finally closed, the guards were left in the middle of the marble floor, surrounded by the same crowd that had watched them take control earlier. But now the looks were different. No longer respectful, no longer neutral. Now they carried the weight of a lesson that would follow them long after this day ended. For several long seconds after the elevator doors closed, no one in the lobby moved. It was as if the entire hotel had forgotten how. The chandeliers still glowed. The piano still played somewhere in the distance. But the energy was completely different from before. What had once felt like a place defined by status, now felt like a place that had just been taught a lesson. The two guards remained where they were, standing in the open space that had earlier been their stage of authority. But the power was gone, not taken from them by force, taken by truth. Around them, the same guests who had watched in silence were now looking at them in a way that was impossible to ignore. Not with anger, not even with judgment, with understanding. The kind that says, you were wrong. The receptionist slowly exhaled and finally allowed herself to sit down. Her hands were still trembling, but there was relief in her eyes. The manager straightened his jacket, trying to restore some sense of order, but even he knew that nothing in the lobby would feel the same for the rest of the day. Because everyone there had just witnessed something rare. Not a confrontation, not a victory, dignity, and dignity has a way of silencing everything else. A few guests began lowering their phones, almost embarrassed that they had recorded the moment. Others looked toward the private elevator, as if expecting it to open again. But it didn't. Steven Seagal had already disappeared from the scene the same way he had been present in it. Quietly, without demanding attention, without using power to humiliate anyone. That was the part no one could stop thinking about. He had every reason to be angry, every reason to demand consequences, every reason to let the weight of his name fall on the people who had disrespected him. But he didn't. Instead, he had protected the staff from further embarrassment. He had given the guards a way to walk away without being destroyed. And in doing so, he had shown something far greater than status. Character. The taller guard finally moved. Not toward the exit, toward the reception desk. His steps were slower now. Careful, like a man carrying the weight of a realization that could not be undone. "I didn't know," he said quietly. It wasn't an excuse. It was the only truth he had left. The receptionist looked at him for a moment and then answered in a calm voice of, "That's the point. Not cruel, not sharp, just honest." Because respect was never supposed to depend on recognition. Across the lobby, a young guest who had recorded the entire scene turned to his friend and said, "He never once tried to prove who he was." And that sentence moved through the room like a final echo. Because it explained everything. Real power doesn't announce itself. Real strength doesn't rush to defend its image. Real dignity doesn't need an audience. It simply exists and waits for others to reveal who they are. The hotel slowly returned to movement. Suitcases rolled again. Conversations resumed in low voices. Staff members returned to their positions. But the rhythm was different, softer, more aware. As if every person there had silently agreed to be more careful the next time they judged someone by appearance alone. Upstairs, in the private lounge, Steven sat once again near a window, a fresh cup of tea in front of him. The same calm posture. The same quiet presence, as though nothing significant had happened at all. Because for him it hadn't been about being recognized. It had been about remaining himself. And that was the lesson that stayed behind in the lobby long after he was gone. Respect should not be a reaction to status. It should be the starting point. For everyone. No matter how they look, no matter what they wear, no matter who they turn out to be. Because you never know when the person you are judging in a moment is the person who will define you in a memory. If you believe true power is staying calm and showing respect first, comment respect ref or ALL, and tell me, would you have reacted with anger or with the same calm dignity?